Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Vibe podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Koch. And today's discussion is going to be based upon his work on Papias, and specifically what does Papias say about the Gospels, what do you know about them, and what his fragments entail regarding gospel authorship. If that being said, Michael, thank you for joining me and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on your program. I'm looking forward to it.
And likewise, just to get us started, who exactly was Papias of Hierapolis for those not too familiar with the man?
Sure. Well, Papias, he's said to be a bishop in a place called Hierapolis, which is in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And he wrote a work called The Expositions of the Oracles of the Lord in 5 volumes, but this work doesn't survive. So all we have are fragments and quotations and allusions to it. All the fragments have been collected by Stephen Carlson, who I know has been a guest on your program. So that's a great book he has on Papias. And a lot of his fragments, the later church writers who are recording him collect very unusual fragments. So we hear about Papias knew some prophetesses who were the daughters of Philip, and they told him about someone who was raised from the dead, and another person who almost became an apostle named Justus Barsabas, who drank deadly poison, survived. We have a story about Judas's body swelling up so much because he was punished for betraying Jesus that he could no longer fit through an area where a wagon could get through. We have this fantastic vision of the millennium, and the wheat and the wine is flowing. So all these unusual traditions, and we might not have given him any further thought, but he's also our earliest writer who records something about Matthew and Mark, and that many scholars believe are the basis for the traditions about the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. So that's why he's been so important for the last 2,000 years of Christian history.
So when we look at what Papias says, and we're missing nearly most of everything he wrote so far, is it clear that he knew all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels, or just Mark and Matthew? And what about John?
Right. Great question. So I'll start with Mark. So what he tells us, if you look at, so Eusebius, who's a church historian in the 4th century, quotes him on Mark and Matthew. So to start with Mark, he claims first that Mark is the interpreter of Peter. And in this case, that probably means he served as Peter's translator. So he's thinking maybe Peter was preaching in his native language of Aramaic and Mark was translating into Greek. The second thing he says, that Mark, because he wasn't a follower of Jesus, but was a follower of Peter, wrote down the things that Jesus said or did, but not in order. And then he talks about how Papias writes that Mark did not provide an orderly arrangement or a compilation of the oracles of the Lord. So there's 2 questions here. What does he mean by oracles of the Lord? And what does he mean by order? Basically, scholars are divided. Are oracles of the Lord things Jesus says? It's like he's an inspired prophet who speaks divine words. Are they prophecies that were spoken about Jesus? So let's say collections of passages from the Hebrew Bible that were believed to prophesy Jesus? Or are they accounts of the things Jesus said and did? So when Christians were giving oral traditions about Jesus' words and deeds, they saw that as kind of inspired speech. So 1 Peter, for instance, talks about Christians who preach the oracles. So I take the latter view, that what Papias is saying about oracles are basically oral traditions that were said about what Jesus said, what Jesus did, that were included in a narrative. And about the question of order, some scholars read that as chronological order. So Papias, Mark did not follow Jesus, so he didn't know the order of events of Jesus' life. But the position I side with is that Papias was referring to rhetorical order. That Mark, it looks incomplete. It has no birth narrative. It just jumps right into Jesus' baptism. It ends with the empty tomb, but doesn't have resurrection appearances. It often just puts one story after another, and they're very loosely arranged. So it says, here's a story that Jesus did on the Sabbath, and then immediately he did this miracle, and immediately he did that, and there's not strong literary connections between different episodes. While when you compare it to something like Matthew has these 5 organized speeches of Jesus, of his sayings, and Matthew is a complete gospel from Jesus' birth to his resurrection. So I think Papias is saying that Mark did not he wrote an incomplete, not well-arranged work, right? Because he was only hearing Peter give sermons about things Jesus said and did, and Peter was just preaching isolated anecdotes about Jesus, and Mark was trying to put them all together and to arrange them properly. So that would be my reading of Papias. So does that apply to Mark, the Gospel of Mark that we have? I think Papias probably was thinking of the Gospel of Mark. And the reason I think this is one that seems to be how Papias was received early on. So in the mid-2nd century, we have a Christian philosopher named Justin Martyr, who talks about the Gospels as the memoirs of the apostles. But in one occasion, he seems to refer to one of the memoirs as the memoirs of him. And in the context, he seems to be saying it's the memoirs written by Peter. And also in that passage, Justin alludes to a verse that's only found in Mark's Gospel about Jesus changing the names of James and John to the sons of thunder. So it seems like Justin has already read Papias and says, Papias is talking about Peter's memoir. So he understands it to be our Gospel of Mark. And Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century takes Papias to be referring to our Gospel of Mark, and he repeats the same tradition about Mark being the interpreter of Peter. The other thing I point out too is, like I said before, I think, you think an ancient reader who's reading the Gospel of Mark, you could get the sense that this looks like it's incomplete because there's no birth narratives or appearance stories after the empty tomb, and because episodes are so loosely tied together. Especially then when you compare it to Matthew's, which looks like Matthew's Gospel, which looks like a much more better organized work, right? Maybe it's not totally fair to Mark's Gospel. There's sometimes where he is a good organizer of material. For instance, Mark loves to do this technique where he has what's called a sandwich technique, where he puts one episode in the middle of another episode and they comment on each other. So an example of this is in Gospel of Mark, Jesus goes to the temple and overturns the tables of the money changers and calls it a den of robbers. But before he goes to the temple, he sees a fig tree that has no fruit and he curses it. And then after Jesus leaves the temple, he goes back to that tree and that tree is withered. And a lot of scholars, people don't know what to make of this story about a cursed fig tree, but it looks like it's a commentary on the temple not producing good fruit and being cursed. And so the way Mark's organizing material is quite clever there. But nevertheless, I think on the whole, we could see why Papias would think of Mark's Gospel this way. And I guess the last thing I would say is Mark's Gospel is very unpopular in the early church. We have very few quotations from it, no real commentaries on it for the first few centuries, kind of ambivalent traditions about it. And Mark's Gospel was included, all of its content was included in Matthew and Luke. So the question is, why did people keep copying Mark's Gospel after they already had a bigger Gospel of Matthew and Luke that they liked a lot more? And I think the reason is because Mark's Gospel got indirectly attributed to Peter. And that goes back to Papias and Papias' source. So I do think Papias is talking about the Gospel of Mark. And I think most scholars, not all, but most would agree with that. So I've said a lot there. I can keep going to the Gospel of Matthew, or would you like me to continue into Matthew?
Yeah, I'm about to ask you a question about that in just a moment. Rhold17, thank you for becoming a member. Appreciate it. But yes, what about the Gospel of Matthew? Not only about what you're going to say about that, but my question on top of what you're going to say is, does Papias seem to be alluding to Markan priority when he states that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew dialect, and he places his mention of Matthew right after he mentions Mark?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And there are some scholars who hold that. So there's a German scholar named Gersinger who held that. Robert Gundry is another one, and Matthew Larson. Because you could read it that Mark did not write his gospel in order. And then the very next line is Matthew arranged the oracles, right? So saying, well, Matthew's improving Mark. The tricky thing there is because Papias's work doesn't survive, it's only found in quotations from Eusebius, or this section is only found in quotations from Eusebius. So it's possible that Eusebius just said, oh, here's an excerpt Papias said about Mark, and here's one he said about Matthew, so let's put them together. So wherever Papias, Papias might have said something about Matthew arranging a work and Mark not being in order, but we can't really determine the order of who wrote first based on how it could just be Eusebius has juxtaposed the two lines this way, right? But if that was the order, then you'd have a stronger case that Papias is saying Matthew improved upon Mark, right? But on the second question, so this is where it gets a lot more debated. So I said, I think most scholars would say Papias is referring to the Gospel of Mark, with some exceptions. Like I know Bart Ehrman would disagree with that. But Matthew is much more debated. So Papias says that Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted, or in my thinking, translated them as best as they were able to do so. So this again gets the issue of, well, what does oracles mean? So like I said before, if you take oracles as sayings of Jesus, you could read this as a reference to something like a saying source. So a lot of New Testament scholars would posit that Matthew and Luke were using Mark's story of Jesus, and they had another source that was mainly a collection of Jesus' sayings that they call Q, from the German word QL, which just means source. So maybe is that what Papias is talking about? Matthew wrote a sayings collection. Or another theory, and this is one Stephen Carlson holds, that Matthew compiled a collection of scriptural prophecies. Like, it's a proof text to use. So when you read Gospel of Matthew, sometimes you'll say, well, this event happened to Jesus to fulfill the words of the prophet. So maybe Matthew was drawing on one of these collections of prophecies that were put together to show Jesus as the Messiah. If you take my view, though, that just like with Mark, that the oracles are oral traditions that people spoke about the words or deeds of Jesus, then you could say, oh, Matthew wrote a narrative, oracles about the Lord. The other thing about it being in the Hebrew language, so the Gospel of Matthew that we have is clearly a Greek text. It is dependent on the Gospel of Mark, which is also a Greek text. So if Papias was referring to the Gospel of Matthew, then he just got this point wrong, right? That Matthew's Gospel is not a translation from an earlier Aramaic or Hebrew source. But you could see where that mistake could happen, because they'd say, well, if Matthew the Apostle wrote it, naturally he must have written it in his native language and other people translated it. Or Matthew is a gospel that seems to be directed towards a Jewish audience. This is what Irenaeus argues, that Matthew wrote to the Hebrews in their own language at the end of the 2nd century. So you can see where that mistake kind of comes about, but it would be a mistake. So I take the view that Papias is referring to the Gospel of Matthew. That, again, seems to be how he's interpreted by figures such as Irenaeus. I think you could make the case that Matthew is the better arranged gospel when you compare it to the Gospel of Mark, because of the way he organizes Jesus' 5 discourses and has a narrative that starts right with Jesus' genealogy and birth and ends with his resurrection and Great Commission to go to all the nations. But I think scholars are pretty split on this one. So, the debate continues with Matthew. I'll just hint at what I'll say next, and we can take a break. I don't think Papias uses Gospels of Luke and John. He might know John, but I don't think he makes, at least in the fragments we have, I don't think he makes any explicit comments about Luke and John.
Hi, Vishnatai. Thank you for your super chat. Could Papias be referring to GSP Hebrews as Matthew?
Now, GSP, are you thinking of the gospel according to the Hebrews?
I'm not sure what he's putting there as an acronym.
Yeah. I mean, I have written a bit about that. So one interesting thing, right after Papias gives these words about Mark and Matthew, Eusebius goes on to tell us that Papias knows First Peter, First John, and a story about a woman who was accused of many sins before the Lord in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Now, there's a question there. Is Papias, does he know this text that's called the Gospel according to the Hebrews? Or does he know an oral story about Jesus showing mercy to some woman who's being unfairly accused? And that Eusebius in the 4th century is the one who said he finds it in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. And I take the latter view. I think, so the Gospel according to the Hebrews, some of the earliest quotations we have. So Eusebius claims that Papias and another Christian named Hegesippus use it, and Hegesippus dates to around the middle 2nd century. But the earliest quotations we have of this text come from Alexandria in Egypt. They come from Clement, Origen, and Didymus, and they're from the late 2nd to the early 4th century. And none of them attribute it to Matthew, right? So it's not till the 4th century that we have 2 church leaders named Epiphanius and Jerome, and they're the ones who attribute the Gospel according to the Hebrews to Matthew. But I think they mix up what was this other Jewish gospel that obviously we know circulated in Alexandria in Egypt with these earlier traditions about Papias, from Papias and Irenaeus and the like, saying that Matthew wrote his canonical gospel originally in Hebrew. So I think those lines get crossed, but not till the 4th century. And when you look at Epiphanius and Jerome, it gets really complicated because some scholars believe that they actually had access to totally different gospels that they confused with the gospel according to the Hebrews. Happy to chat about that more as well, but it's a real big puzzle because, again, it's a text that doesn't survive. So scholars try to reconstruct this gospel based on the surviving quotations from it in the patristic and medieval period. But sometimes it looks like the patristic writers are quoting at least more than one gospel. I think Epiphanius probably knows a totally separate gospel that gets confused with the gospel according to the Hebrews, and Jerome, he might know some earlier commentaries on the gospel according to the Hebrews, and he mixes it up with some other text that was given to him by some Jewish Christians called Nazarenes in the 4th century. So complicated, but I guess back to Papias, it isn't clear he knows the gospel according to Hebrews, and the gospel according to Hebrews is never attributed to Matthew before the 4th century. So that's why I'd rule out that connection.
And you would say that it's not the same text in any case. What the text that Papias is talking about is Hebrew Matthew.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think Papias, in my view, probably just has our gospel of Matthew, and he's mistaken about it originating in Matthew's native language of Aramaic, right? While the gospel according to Hebrews is a completely separate text. So if you actually looked up, there's a great commentary by Andrew Gregory called The Gospel According to the Hebrews and the Gospel of the Ebionites or something like that. He lists all the quotes from these Jewish gospels, and you can just see it's a very different work. So for instance, when Clement quotes it, he has a saying from the Gospel according to Hebrews that sounds a lot more like the Gospel of Thomas than anything in the Gospel of Matthew. Or Origen has this interesting tradition about the Holy Spirit lifting Jesus up by his hairs and putting him on a mountain, and trying to figure out, is this a reference to when Jesus was tempted on a mountain or when his appearance was transformed. But again, so it's a separate text. And it just sort of, it gets confused with Matthew and later traditions, because 4th century church fathers are saying, well, you have a tradition about Matthew writing in Hebrew, and you have a gospel according to the Hebrews, and thus trying to figure out how those things are connected. But originally, those are not connected. Yeah.
What makes you suspect that Papias probably didn't know Luke and John?
Sure. So I think Luke's the easier one. So Papias does have a lot of interesting overlapping traditions with Luke Acts. So, for instance, Papias knows Philip and his daughters, and the daughters are the ones who are telling him these traditions about Justice Barsabas drinking deadly poison and surviving. The book of Acts mentions both those. It mentions Philip having daughters who are prophetesses, and they mention Justice Barsabas, who almost became an apostle, right? Papias also has a tradition where it looks like, so in Matthew's gospel, Judas hangs himself after betraying Jesus. But interestingly, Papias and Acts have a different account of how Judas lives on. So according to Papias, Judas swells up so big so he can't fit through an area a wagon can fit through, while according to Acts, Judas falls down and he splits open, right? So they are totally different traditions, but interesting that they agree that Judas kind of lived on and suffered this horrible fate. Now, in the 4th century, by the way, there's a bishop named Apollinaris of Laodicea. He quotes Papias, and he tries to harmonize Papias with Acts. So he combines Papias' account of Judas swelling up with the fact that Judas had a terrible fall in a field, which we get from Acts. So there's these overlapping traditions, but we don't have any fragments where Papias mentions the authorship of Luke's gospel. We don't have any clear citations or references to Luke's gospel. Now, we also don't really have any clear citations of Mark and Matthew. But we also, it looks like the tradition about Luke as author develops a bit later. So for instance, Marcion is said to have a gospel that looked a lot like Luke, but his gospel has no title on it. So Marcion knows the gospel of Luke and it's circulating anonymously. So the earliest reference to Luke as the companion of Paul comes from Irenaeus. Now, I bet Irenaeus is relying on or like some source, like he made probably the title, the gospel according to Luke, had already been added before Irenaeus talked about it. But it just differs from the fact that Papias, actually, we have explicit references to Mark and Matthew and nothing explicit about Luke till the second half of the 2nd century. So I think Papias's knowledge of Luke can probably be ruled out. There are some scholars who date Luke Acts into the early 2nd century, which is also probably when Papias dates. So Eusebius puts Papias between the 3rd and the 10th year of Trajan's reign. So between 100 and 110 CE, and arguably Luke Acts might date around that time too. So it's possible they were contemporaries. So John is a bit more complicated. Again, we don't have any explicit tradition from Papias about John writing a gospel. So we see those traditions again developing later. So Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century talks about how John was the disciple who leaned on Jesus at the Last Supper, and he wrote the gospel in old age in Ephesus. And we have some other Christians in that latter part of the 2nd century talking about John. So we have a Theophilus of Antioch who talks about John as an inspired person who wrote about the word. We have a Valentinian scholar named Ptolemy who ascribes the Gospel of John. So we have a few more traditions about John, but nothing really early. So So that's one point, that from the surviving fragments that we have from Papias, we have no explicit reference to a John writing the gospel, as we do with Mark and Matthew. The other thing I would say, so a lot of times what scholars will do if they think that Papias knew John, they will look for implicit clues that he knew John. So for instance, Papias, he lists 7 disciples of Jesus. And it looks pretty similar to how the Gospel of John, the order in which it lists the disciples. But I don't think the argument is that strong. I think Papias' list also looks pretty similar to how Matthew lists the 12 apostles. And in fact, Papias mentions 3 disciples on his list. He mentions James, John, and Matthew, and they're not even named in the Gospel of John. So I'm not sure that's a great argument. Eusebius does tell us Papias knows 1 John. So that's, how does he know the letter of John but not the Gospel? Did they circulate separately and he knew the letter but didn't know the Gospel? Or did he know both and just decided not to comment on the Gospel, just commented on Matthew, Mark? I mean, those are the things we could debate, right? But I just don't see any kind of smoking gun, right? No fragment that he talks about John, and no explicit where it's like that could come from nothing else than John's Gospel of the traditions that Papias cites. Now, Papias was in Asia Minor, where John does become quite popular. And it influences actually how some Christians celebrated Jesus' death, the date they celebrated on. So the Gospel of John will come quite popular in that region. I'm just not sure Papias is using it yet, but he might be using 1 John.
Now I want to circle back to what you were saying about Hebrew Matthew earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And the church fathers seem to conflate the Hebrew gospel with Papias' Hebrew Matthew and other documents when they try to talk about it, which complicates any attempt to try to reconstruct the text.
Well, I think it's just the tradition is born. If Papias was referring to the Gospel of Matthew, I think the tradition is just born out of an original error, that our Greek text of the Gospel of Matthew is mistakenly thought to go back to a Hebrew original. If Papias is referring to something else, like a sayings collection or a collection of scriptures, maybe that could have originated in Hebrew. I don't know. At least the scriptures that are included in Matthew's Gospel, sometimes Matthew is quoting the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, so you can't say Papias is talking about the scriptures that were included in Matthew. And even some of the sayings that Matthew and Luke agree on, it looks like they originated in a Greek source. But maybe Papias is talking about something that's been lost. That's always possible. But when we look at the Gospel according to Hebrews, now, so the church leaders who quote it, they look to me like they're quoting it in Greek. Now, it might have had a Semitic background. I guess one clue to that is, the Holy Spirit in the Gospel according to Hebrews, that's quoted in Origin, it refers to the Spirit as Jesus' mother. And that might sound surprising, in my later theological views, right? But the reason is, in Hebrew and Aramaic, the word for spirit can be a feminine noun. So that could lend itself to referring to the Spirit in feminine terms. You get a similar dynamic in the book of Proverbs. It talks about God's wisdom, and wisdom is a feminine noun. And so wisdom is portrayed as woman wisdom, who's calling her disciples to follow her ways. But in Greek, the word for spirit it's a neuter noun. So that suggests that maybe the gospel according to Hebrews did emerge among Jewish Christians in Semitic languages. But I think what the church fathers are quoting is a Greek text. Epiphanius in the 4th century, he knows about these traditions about the gospel according to Hebrews. And he's discovered a gospel in Cyprus that he thinks was the gospel according to the Hebrews. But that is clearly a Greek text that he's found, because it harmonizes the Synoptic Gospels, and it features Greek puns. So it has a play on words that John the Baptist eats he eats honey cakes rather than locusts and honey, and the Greek word for locust and the Greek word for cakes are similar. So there's a Greek pun there. So that's clearly a Greek text that he knows. Now, Jerome in the 4th century, Jerome is an expert on languages. He's the one who translated the Bible into Latin from Hebrew and Greek, right? So he was an expert at languages. And he spent some time in the wilderness, and he was learning Hebrew from a Jewish Christian. And he came into contact with other Jewish Christians or Semitic-speaking Christians that were not referred to as Christians, but were referred to as Nazarenes. And they passed on to him some text that he says he translated. And he identifies this text as the gospel according to Hebrews. But what's complicated about his testimony is sometimes he seems to be referring to this text the Nazarenes given him, and what it looks like is it makes corrections to Matthew's gospel. So, for instance, it talks about Zechariah, a prophet that Jesus said was killed. And the Gospel of Matthew seems to get the wrong Zechariah, and it kind of corrects which Zechariah it was, or it gives the explanation of the name of Barabbas, the thief who was crucified, who was spared crucifixion in Jesus' place. But then other times Jerome will be referring to earlier traditions about the Gospel according to Hebrews, and in these instances, it doesn't look like he is quoting what the Nazarenes gave him. It looks like he's just looking at earlier Greek Christian writers who are talking about the Gospel according to Hebrews. So, for instance, over and over again, he quotes Origen's tradition about the Spirit lifting Jesus up by his hairs and putting him on a mountain. And Jerome says Origen knows this text. So he clearly knows earlier commentaries. So what he's probably done is he's mixed up earlier references with the Gospel according to the Hebrews with some other texts that these Jewish Nazarenes gave him in the 4th century that looks a lot like Matthew. Maybe it was their translation of Matthew. So that's how I read. I get it's such a big puzzle, and that's why I recommend Gregory's book, because you can go through quote by quote in the patristic and medieval period, and just see how scholars try to reconstruct these different gospels that these church leaders were quoting. But I think Matthew's gospel is probably confused with these later Jewish gospels because of these traditions that Matthew allegedly wrote his gospel in Hebrew.
So now I'd like to talk about, I'd like to ask you about your analysis of the John that Papias supposedly worked with. Who was that John?
Yeah. So Irenaeus, he's our first reference to Papias, and he talks about Papias. He says he's a hearer of John and an associate of another bishop named Polycarp. And when Irenaeus refers to John, he takes it. He generally calls John the disciple of the Lord, and he's probably thinking of the Apostle John. So, for instance, Irenaeus will talk about how the disciple of the Lord was the one who wrote the gospel and leaned on Jesus at the Last Supper. And at one point, he quotes the prologue of Gospel John and says it's by the Apostle John. So, yeah, Irenaeus probably thinks Papias knows the Apostle John. Now, Eusebius in the 4th century, he initially agrees with Irenaeus, so he writes a chronicle of history. And he just repeats what Irenaeus says. He says Papias was a hearer of John, the disciple of the Lord. But then when Eusebius writes his church history, he actually reads Papias's prologue really carefully. And what Eusebius discovers is it looks like Papias knew some other person named John. And the reason is, so Papias, in his prologue, as Eusebius quotes it, he's talking about how he gathers information. So he's saying, I was looking at these elders, older people who came before me, and their followers they would come and visit Hierapolis, and I would interview them and try to find out what were the words of the disciples of the Lord. And Papias named 7 disciples, including John. So he names 7, basically apostles, but he doesn't call them apostles. He just calls them disciples. And he says, this is what they said. So he uses the past tense, which implies that they're no longer speaking because they probably died. So going with Eusebius's dating, Papias probably dates that first decade of the 2nd century. I would actually put him around 100 CE. And maybe he's conducting these interviews a little bit before that time. And 7 of the disciples of Jesus, including the Apostle John, they're dead. So he can only refer back to what they said. And then he refers to 2 other figures, someone named Aristion and someone named the Elder John. And he says he wants to know what they were saying in the present tense. So it implies while the previous 7 disciples, including John, were dead, the Apostle John were dead, the Elder John was still around, as well as this other figure named Aristion. Now, he calls the Elder John and Aristion disciples of the Lord, but that would make them awfully old. Now, I guess if you're calling someone the Elder John, maybe he was really old, but we don't have a record of Aristion being among Jesus' disciples. And, if he was with Jesus in the 30s and we're dealing with the end of the 1st century, that would make Aristion really old, but he's never called an elder. So I think Papias uses that term disciples of the Lord loosely for people who follow Jesus, whether before or after Easter. And that Aristion and Elder John are these 2 figures who are kind of authority figures in Asia Minor. So that the Elder John is separate from the Apostle John, in my view. So I think Eusebius gets that right. I think what Irenaeus has done is he has conflated the 2 Johns, right? So Irenaeus tells us that the Apostle John lived to old age in Ephesus. He lived to see the early years of Trajan's reign. But that actually kind of conflicts with what Jesus says in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, that James and John would drink his cup, which seems to be a reference to suffering and martyrdom, right? And so in my view, Irenaeus has probably mixed up the 2 Johns. So it's probably the Elder John who lived to the time of Trajan and was in Ephesus and passed on these traditions to Papias about Mark. So Papias, for instance, when he gives that tradition that I talked about earlier about Mark being the interpreter of Peter, Papias says the elder says this. So that's likely the Elder John is his source for that claim. So yeah, that would be my take. This happens in other instances as well. So for instance, in the book of Acts, we have 2 people named Philip. One's one of the 12 apostles, and one's one of these 7 followers of the apostles who kind of help them out when there's a conflict. And later, those 2 Philips get thought of as the same person, right? So when people don't have last names, it's easy to mix them up in antiquity. So I think that's I think the Elder John is some authority figure who passed on the earliest tradition about Mark's gospel, or about the evangelist Mark. I should say, Papias doesn't use the terms gospels. He talks about Mark writing a narrative of things Jesus said and did, and Matthew writing about the oracles. Yeah.
Fisher Ty, thank you for another super chat. Are you familiar with Pantanius finding a Hebrew Matthew in India around 190 AD, and it had been there for over 100 years, and he brought it back? He brought a copy back to Egypt.
Yeah. So Eusebius actually tells that story as well. So Pantanius, he's in the late 2nd century. He's seen as the first head of kind of a school in Alexandria, what's called a catechetical school. Clement of Alexandria is actually his successor in the school. So Pantanius makes this claim. I don't see any reason to claim. I don't think he was lying. Like there's some debate about where what does India mean when Eusebius refers to that? What exact region is he thinking of? But Pantanius has probably traveled somewhere, and he was given a text. The people who gave him this text said, "This is the original Hebrew of Matthew's gospel that the apostle Bartholomew left here." Now, whatever the veracity of that tradition may be, I could imagine maybe he did encounter a text like a translated version, like as the Gospel of Matthew circulated in different places, it was probably translated in different languages. So maybe they did pass on this version of Matthew's Gospel to Pantanius, and they had this tradition about how it got there. But I don't think, because our Gospel of Matthew on internal grounds is a Greek text and depends on the Greek Gospel of Mark, I don't think you can use his evidence to say Pantanius has the original Hebrew edition of Matthew. I think he maybe has a later translation of Matthew. Maybe one more thing I'll say about Pantanius. He does seem like he's interested in traditions about Hebrew originals. So Pantanius also gives a very interesting tradition about the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is another Greek text, actually a text that's written in probably the best Greek in the New Testament. But he also seems to suggest that that text he thinks is a Hebrew original, and that Paul wrote it in Hebrew but didn't put his name on it because he didn't want to offend people. And then Clement of Alexandria adds that Luke translated into Greek. So I don't think any scholars of the Epistle to the Hebrews holds that. So we have to be careful with these later traditions. But someone's told him these things. So, they reflect what he believed, but they may or may not be accurate.
And so for my final question, what do you think about like when the Gospels were named? Because some argue with each other, wrestle with each other about when the Gospels are given their titles, if they really did, assuming they really were anonymous originally.
Sure.
Since Papias knows about Mark and presumably Matthew, would that mean that they were given their titles before Papias obviously wrote about them, and then Luke and John were presumably given their titles later than Papias' writings?
Yeah. So debated as everything I've said is debated. But so in my view, so again, I put Papias and his source, the elder John, around the year 100, and they're passing on these traditions about Mark and Matthew. But when we look at some other Christian sources, I'm not actually sure Papias wins the day right away, like that he immediately persuades everyone that Matthew and Mark wrote these Gospels. I think there is some evidence that they continue to circulate anonymously. So a couple points for this. So we have another text called the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles. And it arguably knows the Gospel of Matthew. It 4 times refers to the word gospel, and there's some debate whether it's referring to a gospel text or an oral message of good news, but it has 4 references to the gospel. And in one of those references, it looks like it's quoting a version of the Lord's Prayer that looks almost identical to Matthew's gospel, with very slight differences, and very different from Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer. So arguably this writer who composed the Didache knows Matthew, but he never refers to it as Matthew's gospel. He always just calls it a gospel, but doesn't give it attribute it to a named author. Ignatius of Antioch writes letters, and he arguably knows traditions that go back to Matthew. So he refers to the story of Jesus' baptism, or he mentions how Jesus was baptized to fulfill all righteousness. And that's a verse that is unique to Matthew's gospel. And it looks like Matthew added to kind of explain why Jesus had to be baptized. But again, he doesn't attribute it to Matthew. Marcion, as I said, he seems to have some version of Luke, but he has no title to his gospel. It's unattributed. So I think there's some good evidence that in the first half of the 2nd century, despite Papias referring to Mark and Matthew, these gospels still circulated anonymously in different regions. Now, I think probably some point in the middle 2nd century, gospel titles are being added. And that's so in Irenaeus, he's the first explicit source about all 4 gospels and the traditions about all 4 authors. Sometimes I think Irenaeus is drawing on Papias when he talks about Matthew writing to the Hebrews in their own language and Mark being the interpreter Peter. And then he might be drawing on other traditions when he refers to Luke as the companion of Paul and John as the beloved disciple. But Irenaeus clearly knows the titles, which is the titles are the gospel according to, and then Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, what's interesting about those titles, when you say something is the gospel according to, that seems to presuppose you have more than one gospel. So usually you wouldn't say, this is the Chronicles of Narnia according to C.S. Lewis. Because you'd say, well, who else wrote the Chronicles of Narnia? Is there another version according to someone else? But so when you say according to, it looks like you have, okay, we have this gospel according to this author and this gospel according to this author. So probably these titles are added, I think, when you start to get a collection of the 4 gospels together. And the theology behind it is the title always says the gospel, because the idea is there's only a single message of good news. But that good news could be presented according to 4 different vantage points: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? So the title is a way of expressing that there's 4 gospels, but they're unified. Sometimes it's called the fourfold gospel, right? So I think this is happening in the mid-2nd century, where the titles with the author Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John has now been established by this point. And that goes on to influence figures like Irenaeus, who talks about all 4 gospels, or Theophilus of Antioch, who talks about the tradition about John, and then on to Clement and Origen, who also have traditions about the 4 gospels, and so on and so forth. So that's what I would say. And Papias is kind of an outlier. There's some initial anonymous circulation, but about the mid-2nd century, things start to change. And I think you can also see that with Justin. So like I said, Justin seems to be influenced by Papias when he refers to the memoirs of Peter. And he also refers to the memoirs of the apostles. So he doesn't specify Matthew, Luke, and John, but he seems to at least identify the gospels as having apostolic authors. And then you get, the titles and the individual traditions about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Yeah. So I think that's a second half of 2nd century development.
All right. I just want to thank those who super chatted earlier in the membership. Appreciate all of that. And I'll have a link to Michael's Academia EDU page, so you can go over there and check out his articles. That being said, Michael, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I appreciate you sharing that link as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.